Tonight, at some point after the lights go off, you are going to wake up in the dark. Not because something is wrong, not because you are anxious or stressed or broken, but because your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And the fact that this feels like a problem is one of the strangest reversals in human history. You think waking in the night is a failure, a glitch, something to fix with melatonin or a sleep app or blackout curtains. But for most of human history, waking in the middle of the night was not a disorder. It was the schedule. It was normal, expected, and in some cases essential for the survival of the group. The night was not something to sleep through. It was something to navigate. Let's go back. Not as far as fire, though fire matters here. Back to a version of your ancestors who had no alarm clocks, no electricity, no mattresses, no pharmacies, and no concept of sleep as something that should happen in one unbroken 8-hour block. In 2015, a team of researchers led by Jerome Siegel at UCLA published a landmark study in the journal Current Biology. Siegel and his colleagues did something no sleep researcher had done before at this scale. They attached activity monitors to members of 3 different pre-industrial societies: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia. These groups had no access to electric light. Their lives were structured entirely around natural conditions. And what Siegel's team found completely dismantled the modern idea of what normal human sleep looks like. These groups averaged between 5.7 and 7.1 hours of sleep per night. Not 8, not 9. The Western medical ideal of 8 unbroken hours turned out to have almost no basis in pre-industrial human behavior. More striking still was when they slept. Their sleep onset and wake time were not primarily determined by sunrise and sunset, as researchers had assumed. They were determined by temperature. People fell asleep roughly 2 to 3 hours after sunset, when ambient temperature began to drop. They woke before sunrise, as temperatures hit their lowest point just before dawn. The cold woke them, not the light. And here's the part that most people never hear. Siegel's data showed that within these sleeping groups, there were almost no moments in the night when every single individual was asleep simultaneously. Someone was always awake. Not by design, not by rotation, not because they were assigned to watch. It simply emerged from natural variation in sleep timing across the group. The effect was a kind of passive, uncoordinated night watch, a biological safety net that kept the group from ever being entirely unconscious and vulnerable at the same time. Your ancestors did not need to invent a guard schedule. Their sleep patterns were staggered enough that the group was never fully exposed. The wakefulness in the night was not a bug. It was the system working exactly as it should. But what did they actually do when they woke? This is where the historical record becomes genuinely strange. Roger Ekirch, a historian at Virginia Tech, spent over 2 decades investigating pre-industrial sleep habits and published his findings in the 2005 book At Day's Close: Night in Pastimes. Ekirch examined more than 500 historical documents, diaries, court records, medical texts, literature, from medieval and early modern Europe, and what he found was consistent, surprising, and almost entirely forgotten. Before artificial light became widespread, the dominant sleep pattern in the pre-industrial world was not one continuous block, it was 2. People slept what was called a first sleep, woke for a period of 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night, and then returned to a second sleep until morning. Ekirch found references to this pattern across centuries and cultures. The French term for it was premier sommeil. Medical texts from the period gave advice about what to do during the waking interval: visit neighbors, pray, have sex, reflect on dreams, or simply lie quietly in the dark. This was not insomnia. It was the architecture of the night. The period between the 2 sleeps was described in historical documents as a time of particular mental clarity and calm. People reported that their thoughts during this waking interval were unusually vivid. Dreams from the first sleep were fresh and available. The mind was neither fully alert nor fully asleep. It occupied a kind of threshold state that pre-industrial people did not pathologize. They used it. They wrote in it. They prayed in it. Some researchers have suggested that many historical accounts of religious visions, mystical experiences, and creative insights may have emerged from exactly this between-sleep window. Ekirch argues that the invention of artificial light, particularly gas and then electric lighting in the 19th century, compressed the night and effectively abolished this waking interval. People began staying up later, delaying sleep onset, and then sleeping through in a single consolidated block out of necessity. The two-sleep structure was not replaced by a better system. It was simply overwritten by the demands of a world that never fully went dark. And here is where the story loops back into your own body. The neuroscientist Russell Foster, at the University of Oxford, has studied circadian rhythms for decades, and his research consistently shows that the human sleep-wake system has not caught up with the modern light environment. The circadian clock in your brain evolved over millions of years to respond to the natural cycle of light and temperature. What it has not evolved to handle is a world where screens emit blue light at 11 at night, where street lamps keep the sky from going properly dark, and where the pressure to sleep in a single 8-hour block is treated as biological law. When you wake at 2 in the morning, your brain is not malfunctioning. It may be doing something closer to what it was designed to do. The waking interval that Ekirch documented is still there. The circadian rhythm that Siegel's hunter-gatherer data revealed is still ticking inside you. The night watch that emerged passively from the natural variation in your ancestors' sleep timing is still coded into the population-level spread of your sleep biology. The problem is not the waking. The problem is the silence around it. Because in a world with no electricity, waking at 2 in the morning meant a dark hut, the sound of the fire, the presence of the group, the availability of thought. In the modern world, it means staring at the ceiling, calculating how many hours of sleep remain before the alarm goes off. Pre-industrial societies had none of that calculation. They did not measure sleep in hours as a performance metric. Sleep was not something you could do correctly or incorrectly. It arrived when the body called for it and released when the body was ready. Ekirch notes that the word insomnia barely appears in medical literature before the 19th century. It is not that people before that century slept perfectly. It is that the standard against which their sleep was being judged did not yet exist. There is something else in Siegel's 2015 data that most summaries leave out. Across the 3 hunter-gatherer groups studied, napping was not particularly common. Despite what wellness culture often implies about the natural human tendency toward afternoon rest, these groups napped infrequently, more in summer when nights were shorter, rarely in winter. Their sleep was consolidated into the core overnight window, adjusted by temperature and season, with the natural variation in the group providing the passive coverage of the night. It was a system built for the environment they actually lived in. The environment you live in is radically different, but the biology is not. That restlessness you feel in the small hours is ancient. The vivid, threshold quality of thoughts at 3 in the morning is ancient. The sense that the night has more texture than you were led to believe is ancient. Your ancestors did not sleep through the dark. They inhabited it. They used the waking interval between first and second sleep for prayer and thought and conversation and sex and quiet. They understood, without any scientific framework for understanding it, that the middle of the night was a different kind of time. Tonight, when you wake in the dark, and your first instinct is to check the clock and calculate the damage, consider the possibility that you are not failing to sleep. You are waking into a space your ancestors knew well. The body that opened its eyes in the dark 10,000 years ago in a shelter on the African savanna was doing the same thing yours is doing right now. The night did not change, only what you were told to do with it. There is one final thing worth sitting with. Siegel's study found something that did not make it into most headlines. The hunter-gatherer groups he studied reported almost no complaints about their sleep. No chronic insomnia, no pathological fatigue, no epidemic of sleep disorders. Despite sleeping fewer hours than modern medical guidelines recommend, these groups functioned, hunted, gathered, raised children, maintained complex social bonds, and navigated the physical and cognitive demands of lives that were by any measure more physically demanding than yours. The explanation is not that they were tougher, or better adapted, or somehow immune to tiredness. The explanation Siegel offers is simpler. They were sleeping in alignment with their environment. Their body temperature rhythms, their light exposure, their social schedules, and their physical activity all reinforced the same biological signal. There was no contradiction between what their body expected and what the world was asking of it. The sleep that arrived was the sleep the body was prepared for. Yours is not. Your body expects darkness at sunset and silence shortly after. Instead, it gets screens, overhead lighting, irregular schedules, caffeine that extends wakefulness past the window the circadian clock allocated for it, and then the demand to produce 8 continuous hours of sleep, starting at a time that bears no relationship to the temperature curve the body evolved to track. The result is not a failure of willpower or biology. It is a mismatch between a body built for one set of conditions and a life conducted in a completely different set. And the most ironic part of that mismatch is this: the very anxiety that keeps you awake when you wake in the night, the clock watching, the calculation, the dread of lost sleep, is itself a product of the modern framing of sleep as a performance. Your ancestors had no such anxiety because they had no such standard. The night was long, the fire was low, and waking in the dark was simply part of being alive. Tonight, when the ceiling finds you at 2 or 3 in the morning, you are standing at the edge of something very old. The waking interval between first and second sleep that Ekirch documented across 5 centuries of pre-industrial life is still written into the architecture of your night. The passive night watch that Siegel found emerging from the natural spread of sleep timing across hunter-gatherer groups is still operating in the population you belong to. The threshold state of quiet wakefulness that pre-industrial people used for prayer, for thought, for conversation in the dark is still available to you. You were not given broken sleep. You were given an ancient body and told it was living in the wrong era. The night did not change, only what you were told to do with it.